Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Good to see you. Doing something different today. Something, honestly, I haven't done anything like this before, but I got to say, I'm really excited. I've been excited to do this since, honestly, since Sarah first brought it up. Yeah, I think you guys are in for a treat here. And so, honestly, since this is something that is kind of, I haven't done anything like this, Sarah. So why don't you go ahead and explain to people watching who you are and how this conversation came about, and kind of what your goal is with it, and then we can dive in at your lead after that.
Sure. Well, so I'm in your locals community, and we're both in Carlin Borisenko's locals community. And she was doing a talk with James Lindsay, and we were in the chat section. Just everyone was chatting up a storm, and you mentioned, and you were the first person I had ever seen mention this, that critical race theory was spreading like wildfire through Protestant churches. And I have seen this. And I hadn't ever talked to another Christian who really understood even what critical race theory was. When I bring it up to other Christians, often they aren't really sure what I'm talking about. So I was super excited. We only got to talk a little bit about it in the chat, but I ended up emailing you about it later. Or actually, I think I brought it up in your locals community. And yep. We realized pretty quickly that this was a pretty huge topic. And so I sent you an email with some pretty loaded questions for you, just because I was really curious to hear your story. And we had the idea to just talk about it in a video. So I think that kind of sums it up.
Yeah, and here we are.
I'm not really anyone. I don't have a YouTube channel. I am a pretty ordinary person. I think people might be interested in knowing just a little background about me. I think it'd be fair to reveal this about myself, just so people can kind of see where I'm coming from. I'm a wife and homeschool mom. I don't happen to be working right now from home or anything. And I've been a Christian my whole life. So I am coming at it from that perspective. And then I would say politically, I've always been center right. So cool. Conservative libertarian, because I'm a homeschool parent and I was homeschooled growing up. Personal freedom is really important to me. So that's where I come in, pretty hardcore libertarian. Personal freedom is extremely important to me. I like a small limited government. So those are my biases coming into this interview, just to air that out to everybody.
Yeah, I mean, it's good that you know those. And yeah, I mean, whenever you brought it up in my locals, I was like, well, here's some videos that I did. And then I started to write an article that I had called Chasing the Woke Whale. And I was getting into it and I'm like, okay, wait a second. I don't even know where to begin with some of this stuff. And I told you that I'm like, hey, I'm working on this, but I realized that because there's so many different angles to this topic, I want to do it really well. And you said, well, why don't we just do a video? I said, yeah, I'm usually better whenever I'm explaining things verbally than I am when I write them down, or at least I can do it a lot more easily verbally than whenever I write it down. So you'd said you started with a list of questions and stuff. And so just wherever you want to dig into this, I have some notes here that I wrote just in terms of the things that I'd like to cover here, but, take it away. How do you want to begin to talk about this?
Well, our first question we had come up with was just out of curiosity for everybody, what your background in church and ministry is, just to kind of, so we can see the perspective.
Yeah. And whenever I said at the beginning, to people watching this who are familiar with my stuff, like, I do often bring up my faith or, the fact that I went to seminary and those kinds of things, but it's not like a big theme, in anything that I do. And so, I try to preface any video I make that's like, hey, this is mostly going to be relevant for people that would identify as a believer, but, hopefully try to make it not so esoteric that a non-believer wouldn't also find interesting or informative or whatever. But yeah, so, I mean, I grew up going to a Methodist church, but, it wasn't really anything to me. It was just small town. Everyone had a church they went to. And I didn't come to Christ until college through a parachurch ministry called the Navigators. Some men just poured into my life, met with me and answered hard questions, stayed up late, just listening to me be a punk and asking hard questions and being pretty arrogant in the way that I went about it. But God really broke me down. It would have been summer after my sophomore year of college. And then, because I had been doing these Bible studies with these guys, and I was just always I never really took it seriously. And I came back going into my junior year of college, and I was like, hey, I want to do this and I want to take it seriously. I really want to figure this out. And so then it would have been October of 2007 that I accepted Christ. And then after that, did a bunch of trainings and stuff through the Navigators ministry and, summer training programs, leadership training stuff. And so then I became part of the leadership of that ministry there at the university I was at, and did that even through after I graduated and still helped out. And then whenever we moved so that I could continue my education, and I got a master's in theological studies, it was a seminary program. And so that's pretty much my experience there. I've always been, part of ministry in different facets, through leading and, witnessing to people and stuff, and studying and trying to understand my faith. Because what was funny is that even whenever I was in high school, and I definitely wasn't a believer, I was very interested in apologetics, mostly because I liked to argue. I've told people this before, that I like that. One of the reasons why I think I even just red pilling on, more political issues, in maybe 2013, 14 and on, was because I've always had a really, I'd say, a deep value of facts. And, I didn't come from a good place when I was younger. I like to use them to bludgeon people, and I would like to debate people just to be right, not necessarily to change anyone's mind. But because I was really interested in just understanding things, I was interested in apologetics and trying to figure out what are the strengths of these things and the weaknesses of these other things. And so I think I carried that same curiosity for just, making sure that if I was going to say I believe something, that I know how to argue it, I know how to defend it, I know what its weaknesses are, and how to, I guess, defend against any attacks against those weaknesses, and vice versa. So that's kind of my background there. Yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up as best I could.
Okay. So when did you first start noticing critical race theory, both in society at large, but also very specifically, when did you start seeing it in the church?
Well, I would say, I want to reframe the question, because critical race theory is something that I think informs a lot of other things. And so a lot of what, there are churches that are infected with this ideology, and probably have been for years, and not a single person who is promulgating it ever uttered the words, even critical race theory or critical theory, anything like that. But I know that the first time I even heard about social justice in the church was, this was well over a decade ago, maybe a decade and a half. My uncle, who was also in ministry, he was a pastor, and then he did collegiate ministry. And then he got called out he moved to Boston to do collegiate ministry out there. He actually was the chaplain for Harvard for a while, I believe. Chaplain, or some position there that was within, the spiritual guy. But whenever they were talking about their move to Massachusetts, he had said that he wanted to go, he felt very called to a ministry that was about social justice, that focused on social justice. And that was the first time I'd ever heard that terminology. And so I remember asking him, what does that mean? What is that? And he gave the explanation of, caring for the widows and orphans, caring for the poor, those kinds of things. And, basically, a very, I would say, innocent sounding notion of what it means to live biblically, in terms of caring for the least of these, basically would have been how he summed it up. And so that was the first time I ever heard about social justice. But in terms of seeing it in, so I'll use the word the church, but maybe a better term would be the body, because I was part of a parachurch ministry for a long time, and I didn't necessarily have a specific church that I went to, whereas I do now. And so, but when I first started seeing it within the body and the believers that I was around, was, honestly, maybe 2011, 12, something like that, where I started hearing a focus on, we need to get, we're too white. We need to get more people who aren't white in here. And there is a push to try and reach out. There was a black college ministry, and to try and partnership with them and do stuff with them, which again, at the time, it didn't really see, it was like, okay, that's fine. Whatever. I don't see any problem with that. I didn't really understand why they were confused that it was a predominantly white ministry, because the area we were in was way, way, way predominantly white, like probably 94% white. So it's like, I mean, yeah, it's probably going to look like that. But that was the first time
Wyoming.
I'm in Wyoming now. That was in Missouri.
Oh, okay. But that is a pretty white state, isn't it?
Yeah, at least in the small areas. I mean, St. Louis, Columbia, Kansas City aren't as much. Honestly, the town I grew up in was actually, by the time I graduated high school, was maybe only 65% white. Now it's about 50%, because I grew up with a lot of Hispanic and South American friends. There was a pork processing plant. And so we had a huge influx of people from south of the border that moved there. And so I actually grew up in a pretty culturally diverse place. There's people from, Panama and Bolivia and Uruguay, I mean, seriously, all over the place. But anyway, I first started seeing it, that kind of emphasis there. But I remember the first time I saw it in that ministry, and this is something we'll get into later in terms of like one of the places where I see this fight taking place, was I went back. So they do an annual conference, and it's actually the conference I got saved at. And I went back to it in 2017. And I was listening to the guy who mentored me in college, was running it. And so it's still someone that I respect a lot. And I was talking to him, and he was telling me about how he was using words that I knew weren't his words. You know how if your kid comes home and they're saying some things, it's like, you didn't pick up this idea on your own. You got this from someone else. What is this? And he was doing that kind of thing where he was talking about platforming and centering the marginalized, and we want to make sure that we give voices to those who are othered. And I'm like, okay, where are you getting this from? You've got a whole new lexicon from the last time I talked to you. And again, this is say again.
Do you remember what year that was?
2017. This is 2017 is when I first started seeing it in that ministry there. I really wasn't seeing it as much in the church, because honestly, at that same time, so I moved here in 2016, and the church that we go to, our pastor and our church elders are actually, I think, a minority in this way, in that they know what's going on. They keep up with the culture, and they've done a really good job of protecting the church that we go to from being infiltrated by this. And so I haven't seen it in the church, but I was seeing it there in this international ministry. I mean, the Navigators, I was part of the collegiate part, but they're an international ministry. They operate.
So you saw it in Navigators, really?
Yeah. So
2017. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's where I first saw it in the body was then, and I was hearing these things. And what's funny is I was leaving that conference in 2017 with the guy that I knew here, because I just went with someone who was part of my seminary program to it. And I told him then, I said, I hope I'm wrong. I have no reason not to trust this guy or trust, this ministry that, had poured so much into me and invested in me. But if it's going where I think it's going, this isn't good. This is just the beginning. Because at that time I was starting to understand what was going on in the culture and picking up on this ideology that was very race centered. I didn't know the name CRT yet as what informed it on an academic level, or maybe just an epistemological level. But I could see that was happening in the culture. And I started seeing it really in the culture after like Ferguson and Michael Brown as in the BLM stuff. I mean, I often cite that as start of kind of my red pilling journey, in terms of being like, okay, I don't understand how just if the only information we have is white cop, black man, that we know all the things we need to know. I mean, that doesn't tell us anything about the situation. And so like I was starting to see it in the culture then, but then 2017, I remember I was in the car with this guy leaving that conference, and I'm like, here's what's going to happen if the Navigators continue to go down this road. They are going to end up putting people in positions of leadership who believe in this stuff. They'll start doing some kind of training. They'll put it into their training. And it's just going to go from there, and it's going to spread, metastasize like a cancer if they keep going down this road. And unfortunately, I saw that happen over and over again over the past couple of years, and it's only gotten worse. But those were the first times I saw it there. And even just like, I have these like thin sliced conversations that I've had with Christians over the past, maybe 5 years, where I heard them saying things where I'm like, I don't think you know what you're saying, or I know this isn't you, but I could tell that they had, drunk the Kool-Aid, so to speak, on some of these things, and were kind of impervious to any type of debate about it. Like, it was like, this is settled. This is what we need to be pursuing. This is justice. This is God's will, and that kind of stuff. And I've seen some people wake up to it, and I've seen other people just go further down the rabbit hole, in terms of, just, I think they're making shipwreck of their faith by pursuing it. But anyway, but we can get to that part later. But those are the first times I remember seeing it. Was really my main experience with it with believers is in the context of the navigators, and then friends that I ministered with in there, in that ministry. But in terms of like my church, we've been protected. But there are other churches, where I live, where I know people who have talked about it, and it seems like it is spreading, even in a fairly conservative place like here in Wyoming. My wife is part of a mom's group that is run out of another church, and this group they were starting to parrot some of this crazy ideology. And my wife and another gal who actually understand this stuff, talked to the leaders of this mom's group, and they're like, we're worried about this. And the leader said, well, let's go, we'll ask our pastor about it, since we did this out of our church, and see what he says. And the pastor of the church was like, yeah, no, I think this stuff is fine. This is great. And so, whereas I know that if it was our pastor, he would be like, this is absolutely not, and so I know that where I'm at is fairly isolated milieu, in terms of not isolated, but protected, like we're protected. But I'm seeing it in denominations all over the place. I'm seeing it in believers across, a wide variety of political beliefs and spiritual beliefs. Anyway.
So we talked a little bit about when you kind of first started to see things trickle in.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like there was a time before George Floyd died where it felt like the dam had broken? Or I suppose we really could say the dam broke when George Floyd died. That was when, it feels like the pact for a very long time just blew.
Yep.
That's how it looks to me. But so from my perspective, and a little tiny background about me, and I'm interested to hear what you studied in college too. I actually went to school to be a high school history teacher. And while I was in college, I studied obviously I studied history, but the classes I took, I very specifically wanted to study basically the worst things that happened everywhere. And I graduated in 2011. So critical race theory, it's been around since 1970 basically, but it wasn't full blown at the time. It was definitely different from now. But I guess I say that to give a little bit of background on myself, it was kind of like critical race theory light. It wasn't as full blown as it is now. It was kind of,
it was sowing the seeds. I think a lot of it was sowing the seeds. Yeah.
For sure. And it wasn't full blown though. So I was kind of in an interesting kind of in the middle place, but we still were given, I would say I was probably one of the last groups of people to get kind of a traditional education where you really were taught to treat people individually and not stereotype people. It's basically kind of the opposite in a lot of ways as people are taught now.
Yep.
So anyway, for me, from my perspective, looking at things, it did feel like for a few years I was seeing this dynamite being stacked and going, this is dangerous. But in that time from, last year to 2011, I was raising little kids. So I wasn't really, engaged in the pushback necessarily. But I saw it and I was concerned about it. So I know that's a little bit of a rabbit trail, but my question to you is, do you feel like there were times before George Floyd died where it was a red alert to you where you were really freaked out, giant red flags everywhere, and you were saying this is a huge, huge, huge problem? Or were you more just concerned that it was going to be a huge, huge problem? Like when were those breaking points for you? Or was there a breaking point before George Floyd for you, as specifically with churches?
With churches, I mean, again, I would say, so can I use this to as a segue into like some of the issues that make it to where people don't understand it or see it, so that they don't have those red flag moments?
Yeah.
Because I would say, even though I was concerned, I didn't really have, everything seemed like an extension of Michael Brown. So
Yeah.
Michael Brown, hands up, don't shoot, I think sowed the seeds for a lot of different things. One of them is, it set the precedent that truth is irrelevant. It set the precedent that if you are the first to create the narrative, that's what'll stick. Hands up, don't shoot is still, people will stick to that. They will say that Michael Brown was shot in the back, and all those things, despite, I mean, it's just patently false. Multiple investigations, witness interviews. It's like, no, but they'll stick with that. So Michael Brown showed that narrative is more important than facts. And if you have the right narrative, you can do whatever you want. And they did. They burned down Ferguson. And so I think that everything after that was an extension of the precedent that was set with Ferguson. Now, I was concerned about it, but I mean, for me, I honestly, I remember who I was talking to about this yesterday. But I was really, I mean, I voted Democrat all my life. Even in 2016, I voted for Bernie Sanders and then Hillary Clinton. And even though I was waking up to this stuff, I didn't understand it. I knew something was going on, but I still didn't quite understand it. And it took a long time for me to like peel back the layers and read voraciously, in terms of trying to understand these things. My major was political science in college. That was my undergrad. And so I had a lot of the historical knowledge, but I also, for me, it was more like, constitutional law, courts and rights of the accused, civil liberties, all those kinds of things. And so it was more about processes than events. I don't ever remember learning about that much with the Cold War even, or Soviet Union or communism, anything like that, even in any of my classes. I did take history classes, but it was like, the history of the expansion of the United States westward, those kinds of things. But to your question, when were the big red flags? I think for me, whenever it's a slow process, I think for a lot of people, there is that the kind of the red pilling and becoming aware of how much that we're presented with is reality actually isn't reality. Some people have like a sudden moment, and for some people it's gradual. For me, it was pretty gradual, as I just became more and more informed. I mean, and in terms of this stuff being in the church though, and being in believers, yes, George Floyd was the breaking point. Whenever I saw those seeds that were sown over the last maybe 8, 9, 10 years, they bore fruit. And summer 2020 is whenever I started seeing, particularly on Facebook, because the bulk of the people I was friends with on Facebook were people that I had done ministry with, for decades, or not for decades, but for over a decade. And friends that I had made, who at that point, man, that's 13, 14 years in some cases that I'd done ministry with, with some people for over 10 years. And seeing them parroting a lot of this stuff. And I also remember having a conversation with one of my best friends and his wife, who's also very dear to me, where I was hearing them start to parrot some things. And you could tell that, well, I didn't know what exactly they were imbibing, but or where they were getting some of this stuff, but they were asking me questions and I'm like, these are no brainer questions. I can't believe you're even considering this, or this. And so but whenever I was seeing the amount of believers on Facebook and on Twitter that I knew well, that I knew had solid foundations in the Word and had, at least last I'd known, really strong relationships with Christ, parroting these crazy things, and acquiescing to crazy things. I will actually tell you one of my biggest, I would say, in terms of defining and seeing how this affects believers and how it warps their mind, was there was an exchange on Facebook where, again, a friend of mine who I know well, who knows me well, someone had so they had, there was, there's all those things that people share, and it's like a virtue signaling thing, and this person had shared this post where it was like, we're so sick and tired, Black people can't even, and it was a list of, we can't even do this, and then a person's name, we can't even do this, and then a person's name, and it had people on there like Michael Brown, it had people on there like Jacob Blake, right? But it also had people like Amadou Diallo, who shouldn't have died. I think that was in the late 90s. He was just pulling out his wallet, and these 4 cops shoot him. I think there was like over 30 shots fired, 40 maybe. I mean, horrible tragedy. So, and it had cases on there that were clear-cut cases of this is a tragic death, but they mixed it with people who, this is not some obvious racism thing. This isn't Black people can't even this thing. They had Tamir Rice on there, which is a tragedy, but it's not racism. I mean, the cops didn't have the information. The orange thing was removed from the end of the gun. I mean, the kid points it at the cop, and what do you do? All he knew is there's someone with a gun. That's not racism. That's just a tragedy. And so I had commented, I'm like, look, I understand what you're doing here, but if you want people to take this seriously, then you can't include these names that are not good examples. Like, these are not good arguments for the case you're trying to make. In fact, they're actually bad and counterproductive arguments, because they might cause people to dismiss everything on here. If you're including someone like Michael Brown or Jacob Blake or even George Floyd on there. And so I'm like, but here, these other people, these are good examples of the case you're trying to make. So if you want to do them justice, if you really care about this cause, then you want to make the best argument possible. And that means not including bad examples that will discredit your good examples. And I just got a ridiculous amount of hate and vitriol in the comments and replies from people that I didn't know. So this is just on my friend's post. So this is other friends of this person, and people saying like, it's people like me are the reasons that those people are dead. People saying that like Jesus is upset with me. And there was this one girl that left the most virtue signaling garbage nonsense, where she was like, oh, I pray that your heart is purified from this hatred. As a woman of color, I forgive you. As a published author of racial in whatever journal, I forgive you, and all this other stuff. And I'm like, this is just bullshit, to be honest. I mean, this is horrible. And there was another friend of this person who was saying similar stuff. And I was like, hey, look, I'm not going to have this conversation with you because I'm just going to get mad, but you can message me if you want, but this is not the place to do this. And, their response was to straw man. And because I said, I'm not going to reply to anything else. If you want to message me, we can talk there, but I'm not going to reply to anything else. And then this person, they replied to me publicly and, straw manned everything I said and said, ridiculous things, but then they never messaged me because of course. But what was so astounding about that exchange to me is I had messaged my friend on whose Facebook, who had made the post and who knew me, because they didn't say anything to any of these people were it's just vile attacking me. And I had messaged them, trying to explain like, the situation, being like, how are you okay with this, basically? And they didn't get it. They didn't understand. And there was multiple times of me explaining like, look at the character attacks. Look at the things like, you're liking these comments, and this guy is saying that people like me are the reasons that these people are dead. Like that basically I'm a murderer, and I hate Black people or something. Like, how are you okay? Like, this is vicious stuff. And they still didn't understand. And actually that exchange is what prompted me to go down the rabbit hole of looking at this stuff through the lens of relationships and how it poisons relationships and how it turns people into unintentional emotional abusers. I don't know if you've seen that, or in terms of, I've written about this and made videos about it, about how this ideology turns people who mean well into, they imbibe and then they act out an ideology that basically makes them an emotional abuser in relationships, because they are okay with vicious, horrible things as long as it advances the narrative. They have no regard for, how it impacts the people they're dealing with. And so, like, my friend didn't understand that it's like, okay, if I saw someone attacking you, making character attacks against you that I knew weren't true, I would say something. Like, I would say, this is not okay. I would recognize it. But this person didn't see it because it was all of these vicious attacks were cloaked in the, I have the right opinions about this stuff. So they become blind to the vitriol and the hate and the malicious way in which these things are communicated, because all they're seeing is just the virtue stuff. There's this old comic by Gary Larson. I love The Far Side. I've read that growing up. I have all these books, Gary Larson comics. And so there's this 1-2 panel he has that it was What We Say. And it's this owner of this dog saying, Ginger, how could you do this thing? And like scolding Ginger for, I don't know, tearing up a shoe or something. And then it's like, what dog's here? And then it's like, gibberish, Ginger, Ginger, that's all they hear is Ginger. And I think that it's the same way with, believers and probably non-believers too, but I think especially with believers is that whenever they see someone else engaging in maybe attacking someone or just saying things that are maybe generally probably not true, are dubious at best in terms of the claims, they don't see the whole thing. All they see is justice, oppression, compassion. And then they tune the rest of it out. And so those were some of that one for me is honestly probably one of the biggest moments that I had in terms of seeing how this was polluting people. But I had multiple exchanges with people on Facebook that these are people I knew for a long time. And I've told folks that that there's a few things I got out of that summer in terms of communications with people who I'd known for a long time and known me for a long time. One, I was blocked by more Christians than any other thing that, on Twitter. I've gotten into it with communist, socialist, crazy people, alt-right people on Twitter. And I have not gotten near as much hate there as I have from, believers who actually know me over this stuff. Two, the other conclusion that summer is also whenever I'm like, anyone who thinks that evangelicals are going to go for Trump in 2020, particularly young evangelicals, are deluding themselves, because young evangelicals are drinking this Kool-Aid and they are 100% down with the Democrats or the party who actually cares about justice and racial reconciliation, all these other things. And so that's who I'm going to support. And that's what happened. I predicted that last summer, and young evangelicals went way more for Biden than anyone expected. And the third thing I got out of it was, it really got me thinking about what makes Christians so vulnerable to this. And I've had really frustrating conversations with believers where, I've said things like, okay, do you remember the Harper's letter that was sent like last year, a year and a half ago? There was a bunch of lefties basically wrote this letter defending free speech. It had like Noam Chomsky on there and stuff that was saying, hey, we need to pump the brakes on a lot of this crazy far left stuff because it's stifling free speech. It was a big deal. This Harper's letter was. You should check it out. But
Yeah.
what made it a big deal was it was a bunch of very far leftists, or not all of them were left, but everyone who signed that letter were on the left. And they were saying, hey, look, we need to be careful here because we're starting to go overboard. This train's running off the tracks. This ideology, all this race stuff, the stifling of speech, this is not good. We need to stop this. And again, it had activists like Noam Chomsky who signed it. Of course, they also had a whole paragraph about also the Republicans are bad. But, that's not the point. But I remember having conversations with my Christian friends who I would say, okay, even people like Noam Chomsky are seeing this. There are people on the far left, even people like Bill Maher are seeing this. People who are atheists, people who do not have an even remotely similar worldview to us, but they're seeing it and you're still not seeing it. So what does it say whenever, at least in this regard, Noam Chomsky is more enlightened about this than you are, believer? That should terrify you, that they're ahead of the curve. And that shows you how much they have their head in the sand on this stuff. And so that's like, that also, seeing all that stuff play out last summer, and even seeing believers who I knew saying, entertaining the idea that maybe abolishing the police was a good idea. It's like, what are you talking about? And seeing government as the solution. So that's whenever I started to formulate, and try to figure out what are the things that make believers particularly vulnerable to this ideology. And I spent a lot of time doing that. But I would say, yeah, that after George Floyd and seeing all the people parroting this stuff and seeing people block me, seeing people get away with saying horrible things, there are people who I'd done ministry with who weren't white and who were like saying overtly racist things. I'm so sick and tired of talking to white people about this, or dumb, ignorant white people about this. And it's like, you're a representative of a ministry. More importantly, you're a representative of Christ, and you're saying racist things. And just seeing no one says anything, about it. And, I think a lot of it is whenever you see what becomes normalized in terms of the vernacular, the way people talk about things, and what people were able to get away with, that tells you a lot about, the milieu that they're in. If I went to a church and all of a sudden it was just very common for people to make like pedophile jokes or something like that. Or jokes about pedophilia, I would be like, what is this? Why are people comfortable with this? This is not, you shouldn't be okay to say these things, and you shouldn't be okay with this person saying these things. But I was seeing that with the other things, because it's, kind of cloaked in this virtuous worldview that's supposed to be, God honoring, when really it's not. Anyway, I don't know if that answers your question about, what were some of the big breaking points, but seeing that last summer was really huge for me. It was really huge for me. And to see that continue to cascade along the same lines.
It really, I have to say, it was interesting. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. So do you remember early 2020? I actually remember Candace Owens saying in a congressional hearing in January or February, she said, it's an election year, buckle up. The racial narrative is going to hit strong. And I kind of shrugged and said, oh, I don't know. I remember Ahmaud Arbery, and I think they really wanted that to be it.
Yep.
But I remember other cases happening, and they really wanted them to catch fire.
The bird watcher, the guy in New York. Yep.
Oh, the bird watcher. They really wanted that to be it too.
Yep.
But then George Floyd ended up being it. But it was really interesting to me. It felt prepared. No, I'm not, obviously he died. I'm not saying he didn't die. Yeah. Of course he died. But it felt like they were really looking for something.
The reaction is prepared. Yeah, that's how this ideology works. Yeah, they're waiting for a thing, and they know they'll get a thing, and they have the literature prepared. They have the things that they're going to share out there that people will pay attention to prepared.
And people were trained, basically, like the people I knew in moms groups who had been reading up everything for so long. It was like they'd been, it felt like they had been completely groomed for this moment.
Yep.
And they were ready to go. And it was pretty bizarre to see. But tagging on to what you were saying about BLM starting right after Michael Brown, and that being the start of it. So that was 2012, soon after I graduated. And like I told you,
was Michael Brown 2012?
Yes. Well, I don't know if he was 2012, but
I think he was 14. I think he was 2014. Maybe 13.
I think BLM started in 2012. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it happened right after Michael Brown. But I could be off. It's regardless, as soon as it happened, I had told you, like I had researched in college the history of slavery, civil rights all over the world. This was my thing. And I really like genocide, how genocides happen. Like that was what I studied. I won many scholarships and awards on this. So this was something I was very intimately familiar with. And that was why I went to study it, because as a Christian, biblical justice is very important to me. So when Black Lives Matter started, I did sign up for their email list because I was like, okay, you know, and same for showing up for racial justice. And I've always been on those email lists. So I've seen them over many years. And when I signed up, I was like, well, hey, if there's an issue going on in society that I can help with, I want to know, let me know.
Yep.
And so I'm on this list for years. And basically, I would get these emails with no information, really, just ranting. Bullshit, listen. And it was like, well, I love to listen and learn. Okay. Yep. And silence is violence. Well, wait a second. Mm-hmm. So I'm not allowed to speak if I don't say exactly what you say. Don't ask questions to your friends of color.
Yep.
Why don't you want friends talking to each other about contentious issues? They don't need to educate you.
Yep. You have to do the work.
Educate you. Yeah. From this book list, nothing else. Really? I'm not allowed to read anything else? Just this? Okay, that's interesting. And just reading from Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi, but it was very interesting to me because it would feel like they would start with some, it was like a bowl of dog poop with chocolates, chocolate chips sprinkled throughout. And they'd be like, hey, that's real. Well, sure, that's something, but it's completely infected by all this stuff. Yep. Instead, why don't you just have a chocolate bar completely separate from it?
Yep.
Anyway, but it was interesting because I followed it for years. And then I remember, I couldn't tell you the year exactly. I'm going to think it's either 2016 or 2018. I'm thinking it may have even been later, like 2018, where basically both BLM and Showing Up for Racial Justice were like, so here's how you really fight racism. Wait for it. Vote Democrat.
Yep. Yep.
And once they kind of revealed that this is the way you do it, nothing else, I laughed my butt off and I was like, nice try. Yep. Your policies stink. I don't agree with any of them. They have disastrous consequences. I am here for any real issues, but you must bring me the issue and the policy you want to solve it and make an argument for it. I'm not going to fall in for all this, but
a lot of people did. A lot of Christians did fall for it.
A lot of people did. Yes. And I'm interested. I'll have to ask Deb Philman, but I'm interested. So I wrote a note. You said something and I thought, oh, when you're saying people, they don't hear things, but they do hear the catchwords. This is about justice and not, being anti-racist. Those are good things. So I say yes.
Yep.
So I have 3 things. I wonder if that has to do with lack of critical thinking, lack of reading skills, and I guess critical thinking skills also, like, can you recognize propaganda and manipulation? How do you research and fact check, and look for biases? But also, I think a lot of people were really hurt by not having good historical knowledge going into this. I think a lot of people are so, and this kind of goes into school systems, really. When I was doing my student observation, I was really horrified to see how poor our education system is. And it's really pretty shocking. I student taught AP US history and AP US government, but I did see lots of the on-level history, and they were at high school senior levels. They were really performing at an elementary level. Honestly, maybe my kids are 6 and 8, and honestly have, and I say this seriously, probably have a better understanding of history than a lot of adults. And not because they're, like Albert Einstein in the flesh. I'm not bashing them. I'm just saying it's nothing like that. It's just that we constantly are reading and talking about history. And I was reading something that 22% of millennials don't even know what the Holocaust is, or if they've ever heard of it.
Yep.
So I think a lot of people, when they are hit with this propaganda, they're so shocked because they've never heard of this stuff before, because they don't know anything about history.
Totally.
And so I think they just really weren't prepared,
Yeah. So let's go there. So would it be okay? Can I talk about, how I've seen just some examples of how I saw this progress through the navigators. And this is just an example of how it does this thing in organizations. And then maybe go to, I would say, 4 or 5, maybe 6 vulnerabilities of why Christians are so vulnerable to this. Would that be okay?
Yeah.
Down that
yeah,
road?
yeah.
So I remember even like right before I moved, there was like one of my good friends who went on staff with NAVs. They were reading, I want to say it was, I think it might have been White Fragility or Mapping the Margin, not mapping. It was something along those lines. I know that the white privilege thing, the unpacking the invisible backpack, I don't know if that was a book or not. I know it was a paper. But they part of their training to be on staff with NAVs was one of those books. And this was maybe in 2016, somewhere around there, give or take a year. And I remember picking it up and being like, why, what is this? And he was telling me, and again, at that point in time, I was still trying to understand. I knew it wasn't good. I knew it wasn't right, but I didn't know enough about it to know what it was. I was just like, well, I can just tell you on face value why this seems like it's ridiculous. And then I told you in 2017, I went to that conference and saw that. And some of my friends who were still, deeply involved in it, who were on staff, I was talking to them and sharing with them what I was learning. And some of them were starting to go, okay, I think I see this. And then it was either later in 2017 or in 2018, they did this. They hired some people to come in and do this new training, and it was all diversity, inclusion, equity stuff. And one of my friends emailed me like their homework list, and it was just crazy propaganda. Articles.
Wait, so is this for someone in the Navigator?
No, this was so let me clarify. This was a training for every single person who is going to be on staff. Every single person. That this was a thing, and there was different. There was like wave 1, wave 2, wave 3 type thing. But it was just this one-time training thing they were going to do, and they brought some people in, I think, to create this curriculum. But again, it was all pure propaganda stuff. It had white fragility and Ibram Kendi, all that kind of stuff in it. And I remember telling my friend, I said, look, this is either the person who came up with this list of stuff has no idea what they're doing, no idea what they're talking about. And so that tells me that maybe, this isn't as entrenched in the ministry as I thought it was, because this is some like really sophomoric stuff they're sending. Or they do, and they intentionally picked this radical stuff. Either one of those should be concerning, because either you have someone in charge who doesn't know what the hell they're doing, or you have someone in charge who does know what they're doing. Either one of those is bad. And so I sent him some stuff to kind of counter, like, hey, here's some things you should look into. And maybe a year later, they hired someone to basically do an audit of how did the training go. Okay. And was it a good investment? Was it a good idea? And I remember my buddy sent me like the video of the guy who did the audit and explaining it, and explaining like, all of the consequences and implications of them doing this, basically diversity, inclusion, equity type stuff. And my friend is like, yeah, you're going to be really excited about this one part. And the part he was talking about was the guy that they had hired to do the audit. What he said was, all of this stuff is, you could do the racial stuff, the racial justice, you can pursue this, and that's a good thing to pursue. That's a worthy endeavor. But if you do it, you won't be fulfilling your calling. Here's your calling. And this is central. So if you pick this other stuff, that's fine. It's good to do that, but you won't be fulfilling your calling. My friend is really excited about that. And I said, you have no idea what he actually said. You don't understand what that means. And he said, well, then tell me. I said, think of it like this. If you hired someone to come and get rid of the ghosts in your house that your house was being haunted, and you had someone come in to try and, get rid of the haunting of your house because you believed that was a thing. And then you brought in some other person to assess how their ghost busting went. And that person came in and said, look, that's not how you get rid of ghosts. Okay. That's bad. That's terrible. This is how you get rid of ghosts. You would say, no, that's not the answer. The answer is there's no such thing as ghosts. Right. So I said, what that guy did by saying this is a good and worthy endeavor is he validated it. He validated it. All he criticized was the packaging and the ways in which it seemed in that packaging to conflict with your mission. I said, so here's what they're going to do. All they're going to hear is this is a good and worthy thing to do. And then they're going to twist it and they're probably just going to bake it into your regular training. It won't be some one-off thing. It's going to be part of the staff training for every single staff member. It's just going to be part of the curriculum. And he's like, oh, I don't think so. Yeah, that's exactly what they did. That's what happened. They made it just part of the curriculum. And there's been multiple things like that I'm like, hey, here's what's going to happen. Here's going to be the next thing. And so I've had conversations with people, about this and what it was going to do to their organization if they allowed it to spread and metastasize. And even the people who are interested in listening didn't seem to get it, didn't seem to understand. I even had a conversation with a friend last night. That in the back of my mind, I was like, I'm really glad that I'm having this conversation tonight. So it's going to be fresh in my mind when I talk to Sarah tomorrow, because it's a good example of why this, one of the reasons why Christians are so vulnerable to this stuff. And the one I had last night reminded me of one I'd had before, maybe over Christmas, and I'll talk about both those. So the one I was talking to a friend over Christmas who understands this stuff, and understands this is bad. And he was at some big, NAV training thing. And he called me to tell me he's very excited and encouraged by this. He's like, I was talking to these other people and, they don't agree with this stuff either. And so it's like, we're talking about it, trying to figure out what to do. And I'm like, what do you mean? Where are we talking about it? He's like, well, we'd have to go, keep our voices down and, shut the door or we couldn't talk too loud about it or do too much because we didn't want people to hear us. But it was cool that there were other people who were also seeing this. And I said, you realize you're celebrating the fact that truth has to hide? This is not a scenario that you should be excited about. You're in a milieu where the truth has to go and hide in these little clandestine gatherings at the end of the corridor, because something other than truth is the prevailing ideology where you're at. Why are you celebrating that? You should not be encouraged by that. You should not be encouraged by that. And the conversation I had with my friend last night was similar, where he was like, he's like, we had a meeting with our regional director and, and this stuff got brought up and everyone seemed to voice some kind of concerns with the regional director. And so, it was really cool because it seems like we're going to start some lines of dialogue and maybe be able to have some conversations about it. And I'm like, this is the same thing over again. You shouldn't be excited about, we're going to start some lines of dialogue and maybe have some conversations as this is spreading. And so I think one of the reasons why, if it's okay, can I just go down like a list of why I think Christians are vulnerable to this stuff for the sake of time?
Oh, I'd love to hear. Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So I think one of them is that they don't understand it. They don't understand the threat that it posed. And I told my friend, I said, listen, would you be just as excited? I said, let's say that the navigators started using astrology in Bible studies, or they started trying to integrate, worshiping Baal or something like that, or some type of polytheistic idea or some other perversion to the gospel. And they were putting this in the training and they were wanting you to teach it to students. Or they're handing out Mein Kampf. I said, pick something. And you had a meeting with your regional director and you raised the issue of, hey, I don't think we should, these are evil things. These are things that are not compatible with the gospel. Would you be content with, I think we're going to be able to have a conversation later about, the efficacy of using a Ouija board in Bible study or something like that. So would you be happy with that? If they were trying to integrate these other things, if they were trying to integrate Buddhism or something into it and make it compatible with Christianity, would you be happy with that? Or would you be your sole mission to say, why are you doing this? And to try to get them to stop. He's like, yeah, I probably wouldn't be happy. I said, exactly. You don't understand that this is the same thing. It's a perversion of the gospel. It's a false gospel. It's a false salvation narrative. It's a false understanding of sin. It corrupts relationships. It corrupts our view of God. It corrupts our view of redemption, all of these things. And ultimately, the people who imbibe it do and will make shipwreck of their faith and lead others to do the same if they continue to go down this road, because that's what this ideology does. And I said, in the same way that you would not be satisfied with, maybe having a future conversation about if they were handing out Mein Kampf to students, you should see this as the same thing. You should see it as the same thing in terms of it either is the gospel or it isn't. And so I think that first part is that they just don't understand it. And on top of that, there are some things that I think are specific to Christian relationship dynamics within the body that makes it very difficult for them to address this. One of the things he told me, my friend last night said, he's like, yeah, I think, part of it is that, our regional leader is good friends and ministered with one of the people who's coming up with a lot of this stuff. And so he just wants to, he doesn't want to not be nice. He cares about the relationship. And I'm like, exactly. That's right. He is more concerned with the relationship than he is with truth. And so I think the fact that that believers, at least in my experience, the environment I was, kind of brought up in my faith was one where you are very charitable to other believers in terms of what they say. You try to understand it. You try to be as gracious as possible with it. You try to listen as much as possible. And so I think that what that does is it causes people to give the most charitable possible interpretation to things that are vile, like CRT, based ideology and worldview and perspectives. I think the other thing is it causes, again, I make the joke that, when whenever I was on like a ministry team, leadership team, doing that kind of thing, whenever there was any issues, it was always kind of like, okay, I want to think about it, maybe get some counsel from someone else. And then maybe I'll go and ask this person to coffee, and then, we got to reschedule. And then, we'll talk, and then maybe, okay, we'll meet again here in a couple of weeks. And there's just this really arduous process that I don't think is necessarily a bad thing in a lot of cases in terms of really trying to be gentle when it comes to handling disagreements, especially if it's over something that you might not understand the nature of, right? That it's like, okay, while maybe there's one or two people who are in the process of trying to understand it and, okay, let's talk about it and explain this to me again, it's spreading the whole time. So there's an asymmetry there of what would even be constituted as resistance isn't really resistance. And in the meantime, this stuff is spreading unopposed. And by the time this person might even go, oh, I figured it out, it's been a year and a half and this is already there. Like, and now, when I could have done something before, I now am facing much different odds. And going back to that, the reason they don't understand it, I think another reason why believers are so vulnerable to this. So a lot of the other things, I'll get back to the micro, the relational aspects, but on a macro level, I think that the church body generally, and I think this is across denominations, parachurches, whatever, has done a really bad job on average. I'm sure there's some better than others of understanding our culture. And they use the same cultural template that was probably concocted in the 60s for understanding, the nature of the struggles that people face in our cultural environment. Maybe the one update they would add is pornography. But other than that, it's don't get drunk, don't love money, don't have sex before you're married. And that's kind of their understanding for their framework for trying to help believers, navigate the culture that we're in. And what fascinates me about that is, at least in my experience in traveling overseas and knowing other people that travel overseas for mission trips and stuff, there was always a cultural training component. There's always okay, so you're going to this country, you need to understand their culture. So don't shake hands with this hand, do that, this, all these other things so that you can be an effective witness in this culture. You don't want to go there without understanding it. And I know that there are some places that don't do that, but the vast majority that I know of do at least have some kind of, you need to understand the culture you're going into type of training. And we do this in every, field that we send people into, except for our own. We don't try to understand our culture and what's going on in the culture. I remember whenever gay marriage was passed, and I think that was in 2014 or 15, I told the guy who's the campus director at the time, for the Navigators, I said, we need to get up there. We need to have at least one night where we talk about this, where we talk about what our beliefs are on this, and open it up to questions if we want to or whatever, but be ahead of what's up.
Can you give me just a second? I'm so sorry.
You're fine.
Mom, it's fun.
I'm going to pause the recording, guys. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right, welcome back. I heard their daughter in the background. That was adorable. But I told the campus director, I said, you got to get ahead of this, because this is now going to be the norm. And what is legal is often presumed to be moral. And so this is going to be a thing that these students are going to be wrestling with. And so you want to be proactive, not reactive. And they didn't listen. I also had another idea where I was like, maybe we should start like a men's thing where guys, we get together, we exercise together, we study and memorize the word together. And then we also study the news, watch documentaries and talk about current events. So that, whenever, these students at the time, the guys who I was talking about were students, like, so that whenever they go out into, the corporate environment, that they're ready to engage with people on the ways that those people engage. And so they're informed. They don't seem like, just some bumpkin who doesn't know what's going on. And, that idea was also met with like, well, what's the point of that type thing? And so my point is that for some reason, Christians inexplicably, again, this is on average, they ignore the culture and they don't see it as being something that's relevant to understand in any substantive way. And so they're always reacting and playing catch up. And so that's how they make massive blunders, like the moral majority trying to, pass anti-sodomy laws in the 90s and 80s as if that was a good idea. It's like you don't legislate your religion in that way, because then people will do it as soon as they have power. And that's what we're seeing now. The left is just trying to legislate their religion back at us. But I think they're just woefully misinformed about it. And so as a result, think of it like this, I've seen this with people who, if you're in a position of leadership and you ignore these things, and then all of a sudden you have to have an opinion, you have to know, like someone comes up to you and says, what do you think about X? You're just going to go and just with whatever sounds good, and I saw that happen multiple times with multiple examples. A guy who I really respect, he's like, again, he had no idea about any of this stuff. And then it was there in his face and he had to figure out what he believed. He was like, well, I had one of my students, he was a black guy and he got pulled over and he didn't do anything wrong. That wouldn't happen if you were white. I was like, do you have any other information about this? He was just he got pulled over. Did the cop say he didn't do anything wrong? And, and so my point is that I think in those situations, I think they just default to whatever seems like the most compassionate thing instead of, asking questions or trying to understand it. And then you just keep going down that road. And I think there's another aspect where, so they're ignorant to the culture. So they're constantly reacting. And if you're just reacting and you're not taking the time to understand things, you're going to take shortcuts. Shortcuts are going to involve probably a quick Google search. And what's a quick Google search going to pull up? Some articles from Vox or Vice or something like that. So there's that part. And then back to the micro level of why I think believers are vulnerable to this. So they're ignorant of it. The process they don't understand it. The process for trying to address it is very slow and arduous. They care more about relationships oftentimes. But I think also like we are trained to take rebuke seriously. So if a believer, a fellow came up to me and said, hey, I want to talk to you. It seems like you're being, this way, like this is not honoring God in this way, or you're not being loving here. It seems like you're being selfish here. Like, I want to take that seriously and understand it, right? It's like, okay, I trust you. And I don't think you would just make this up. So I want to try and figure out, what I could do to address that and really, do some soul searching there. And so I think whenever someone says, well, you're part of a system of oppression and racism, and you have all these internalized things, believers are aware. They're like, yeah, actually, I do have a sinful heart. And so I very well could have done those things. And I want to understand it. Okay, how am I doing that? And so I think they're vulnerable to those things because they take rebuke seriously. And again, as that charity, it's like, I'm just gonna be charitable to all that stuff. It allows the ideology to spread on an institutional level within whatever organization it's in, or church or whatever, while people are taking however long they're taking to try and figure it out. So I think that taking rebuke seriously is also a big part of it. And on the other side of that, like, I think the vast majority of believers who go down this road, they don't understand what it is. The metaphor that I came up with a long time ago is, this is maybe like 4 or 5 years ago when I was first noticing this. I'm like, okay, so there's like this big ball or a big rope. Someone's holding a big rope, and you see them, they're in a field. It's a friend of yours, and it's like, why are you holding that rope? And they say, oh, and it says like justice on the side, or it says, compassion or love or something like that. Like, oh, it's because I love justice, or I love compassion. Or don't you? Aren't you a good person to do that? Well, yeah, I do. I want to take the commands of the Bible seriously. So yeah. And so then they break off a piece of the rope and hand it to you. And now you're both holding it. And what they don't see is that all the way down, rolling hills, that rope connects to this giant rat's nest of twine that says collectivism and socialism and, all these other, privilege and, just pick a thing that they don't realize what they're tethering themselves to. And so that's what's happening at the systemic process or institutional process while they're, figuring it out. But I think most of them, because they don't understand it, and they just think they're like, I can't think of any believer I know who truly understands this stuff on any like epistemological level, and also advocates for it and says it's a good thing. Maybe one. The rest are just doing the Mott and Bailey thing and parroting, here's the thing I'm saying, here's what I think it means. And so I'm going to argue for that, despite that not being what it means. And so because of that, because they're just, their heart really is in the right place, and they really are trying to honor God. I think that this ideology is unique in that we don't check it the same way we do other things that, would be sinful or something like that, because we often do that. It's like, you do a heart check. It's like, is my heart in the right place or not? And if not, like, I'm going to feel guilty. I'm going to feel like, oh man, like, I'm going to be, I'm going to be remorseful for something that's sin once I check it against, like, okay, what was that really motivated? Okay, well, I really wasn't loving there. I didn't love my wife here, or I wasn't doing this thing, honoring God here. But are you still there, Sarah?
I am, yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
Yeah, I'm here.
But anyway, but because most people don't understand it and their heart isn't in the right place, when they do that check, they check it against, okay, what are my intentions here? Well, I do mean well. I do think that this is, important. I do care about these people. So how could you tell me that this is wrong if, I have this shallow understanding of what this verse means, and I have this shallow understanding of what compassion means over here, and I know I mean well, so how could I be wrong? And so I think that also makes it very difficult, because you're not talking, like, I think at least with the prosperity gospel or something like that, you can get to the, the heart issue and be like, this doesn't line up with scripture, and it doesn't line up with where scripture says your heart should be, in terms of what it means to live biblically. And, but with this stuff, I think that there are ways in which it does twist scripture really well and hijacks people's good intentions, to make it where it's like, well, I know that the person who told me about this, their heart's in the right place. I know my heart's in the right place. So who are you to tell me otherwise? So those are just a handful of the things that I think make Christians particularly vulnerable to this. And the last one there that I kind of touched on is it just a shallow understanding of the word. Whenever I made those 2 videos this last summer about how Christians should view, like, I think I talked about legislation and like people who use the Bible to justify legislation. And then another one was just how Christians should view their relationship with government generally, as explained through obviously biblical lens. I think most believers, and I would definitely fall into this category before I understood this stuff, I didn't see legislating, the way I thought particular verses ought to be expressed as a problem. I was like, well, the Bible says we're supposed to do this. Here's a program that does that. So therefore, why wouldn't I support that? And so, my concept of biblical governance, my concept of what it looked like to act out obedience to different verses was way skewed. I didn't understand, okay, these are verses that were given to individuals in the context of they are believers and they are supposed to act these commands out in a unique way as led by the Spirit, within their own family or their church, or their community or whatever. And it's going to look different, and so that's the context in which, Jesus says, do this or do that, or don't do this or don't do that. And to say that Jesus was a socialist or something like that, or anything like that, is a complete misread of the scripture. It's a complete misread of the context in which those verses were given. The argument there would be, well, if you say that, then that would mean what that would look like is actually if Jesus came and then all the disciples, or after he died, they took control of Jerusalem and then they taxed everyone who didn't believe how they believed and used that as to create a program to get bread out or something like that, as opposed to they came together, had a conviction about what they should do, to live out this verse, and then did it, and didn't force other people who weren't involved in that to pay for it or support it or whatever. But my point is that most people just have a really shallow understanding of the word, to be honest, and a biblical worldview. And because of that, they become prey to this. And the last thing is, I think believers are used to being the good guys in their own mind. I think they're used to being the ones that's like, I'm the compassionate person. I care about people. And I mean that sincerely. I think they're used to going, I do care about them. I'm talking about the ones who take their faith seriously, and so when all of a sudden the culture is saying, actually, this is compassion, this is love, this is justice, then they're like, wait a second. It is? Okay, well, then I guess I'm over there, because those are the things I care about. I'm used to being on the side of those things. We're supposed to set the captives free, and we're supposed to break the chains of bondage, and all these other things. And so, they just go with that because they're used to being the good guys with the moral high ground, at least in their own mind. I'm not even saying as a cudgel, but, if you really believe the gospel and you really believe the Bible, then you believe that it is the way to live. It's the right way. God is the definition of good. He's a definition of holiness. He's a definition of righteousness. And so to obey him is to live out principles that at least if we do it well, is the way to live out holiness, is the way to do good, the way to live out righteousness. And so they're used to having that perspective of this is the purest form of, morality, for lack of a better word. And so I guess I'm part of that, because if that's what everyone's saying is moral or is good or is right or whatever, then I guess I'm in with that. It's exactly what you're saying about when you sign up for the emails and stuff, because we're just used to being, on that side.
Right.
So I don't know, there was kind of a lot there, but those are the ways in which I see, believers are vulnerable, again, maybe 5 or 6 things, both on a macro level in terms of ignoring the culture, but then on a micro level in terms of how we orient ourselves relationally in the world.
So one thing you mentioned, I think the devoted, those Christians who are completely 100% sold out for critical race theory. What makes that very powerful, you have the passion of their faith behind it, right? But also in their minds, they're kind of like, they see themselves like kind of a figure like, Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King,
William Wilberforce,
just these amazing epic people, Corrie ten Boom, like this wonderful, righteous soldier for good. And they're completely convicted of that, head to toe. Nothing you say to them will get through to them. They're totally convinced that is the truth. And they are on the side of good, and that everyone against them is so evil. And the personal character attacks are so vicious that anyone who speaks up, and culture is on their side 100% now.
Yep. Which should be a red flag to them. Which should be a red flag.
Feedback.
Yeah.
Right. but they feel, but they've bought the lie that, oh, they're truly, they are the ones fighting the evil.
Yep.
So that gives anyone who speaks up to this, they know that they are going to risk, even though what they're doing is right and good, they will lose their reputation and they will be branded a racist, white supremacist, evil, oppressive person who's just a total bigot.
Or complicit.
And no one wants those labels.
Yeah. Or they'll be patronized
exactly.
as, you are complicit in this. And I pray that God would open your eyes, to those kinds of things. And then, and it's a patronizing dismissal, So either one of those is horrible, right? And totally deflates any confidence you have to keep going.
Right. And so I just finished this book. I know I told you about this book, but for your readers, Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth.
I read it on your suggestion. It was amazing.
Did you read it?
I did.
It's good, isn't it?
Yes, it's fantastic.
So what really helped me with it, this has really helped me with this topic. And one thing he says is basically that what Christians need to remember is that what we say and what we do and what we stand for, we must do it, even if it's totally unpopular, even if it could, even if the consequences of doing so are absolutely dire, we must do it because God is our judge. He's the one we need to be worried about. We need to be standing for truth, even if it comes at great personal cost. And so that was really encouraging to me. But yeah, I think that's one thing. And another issue I think we have is that they are very good at branding themselves as the side of loving tolerance. And if you really seriously question it, you can see through it. But the interesting thing is I find more, shall we say, not even just political, religious as a whole, more conservative Christians, I've found that the church is not necessarily very good at PR. And Hope Rising, that book covers this very well, that Christians actually are very generous. They have big impacts on their communities. They give their time, their money. They actually have very positive impacts. But because of scripture, they're wired to not necessarily, you're kind of taught not to shout that from the rooftops and do it to impress people. You're taught to kind of keep it to yourself. And that has kind of allowed the church to be branded, because you see, say 7 out of 10 Christians are incredibly generous. And you have 3 out of 10 who are slacking off and they actually are kind of selfish and aren't taking it seriously. Because these people aren't really talking about it, you have these people and people are like, oh, all Christians don't really care about helping the poor, helping people who are oppressed. They just care about themselves. When it's like, no, Christians spend a lot of time heavily invested in fostering adoption, food banks, all these programs locally, across the country, globally, but they're not very good with PR. So some pretty dangerous lies and stereotypes have been spread. I do have another big question for you, but I do agree with you, though. You're the only other person I know who has seen this. And I wish, well, and I guess we could go into, this is really more of a political off point, but about the Republican Party not being very good with marketing and branding and whatnot. But I saw a lot of young people walk away to the right. Young Christians walking from the right to the left because of things being said about immigration. That was a big one. Race, the president's a racist. Oh my goodness, he's a sexist, and so a lot of people just fleeing, oh my goodness, Republicans, all they care about is evil capitalism. It's oppressing people and we got to run to the left. That's the side of the love. And pretty interesting. I even saw whoppers online saying things like, oh, Trump is going to be putting homosexuals in mass in concentration camps, which is just so egregious and ridiculous. But I saw that being spread, it was several times. It wasn't like just one time I ever heard that. And it's like, where are you getting this from? So you're the only other person I've heard see that trend and that concern, like with specifically younger Christians, really shifting that way, because that's how they see it. And I just think that's interesting. But yeah, that book, I think, covered that pretty well, how
Sarah?
I thought it was, oh, sorry about that.
No, you're fine.
So finally wrapping up, I know we only have a couple more minutes. I'm curious what your recommendations would be for Christians, best practices when they're talking to their friends, their family, just in church, society. What would you recommend as best practices for Christians? I had this quote from here, and I was kind of interested in your feedback, not only on the verse, but also just kind of how you would recommend Christians act in general, social media, in-person relationships, whatever. Let me see. Okay. The Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil, correcting his opponents with gentleness. God may perhaps grant them repentance, leading to a knowledge of the truth, and they may come to their senses and escape from the snare of the devil after being captured by him to do his will. And for anyone curious, that's 2 Timothy 2:24-26. So I thought that was really interesting, but was just kind of curious what you would say, and if there's any books or organizations of Christians fighting back against this, any parting words you would have for Christians who really want to push back.
Yeah, so two things I'll say. I'll do the resources first. I think Center for Biblical Unity is great. Sovereign Nations is good. Anything by Vodi Bakum is fantastic. Samuel Say is also really good. There's a few Christian apologists who are dealing with this stuff. Oh my gosh, I'll put them I'll put links to it in the description of this of the video whenever I post it.
Any
those are a few, and then
also.
Yeah, I think this book was great. And so I think there's a lot of secular books that will help understand it. I think White Guilt by Shelby Steele is fantastic. Either Discrimination and Disparities or Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell is also good. Cynical Theories by James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose is fantastic. So those are resources, but I honestly don't think it's as much about resources. I think in some cases it is. But the main thing that I try to get across to people, and that I encourage my fellow believers to do is the strategy that they use for confronting this is, we have, so that verse you read from 2 Timothy is good. And what happens is the Bible has a lot of commands, particularly in the New Testament, for how we're supposed to deal with, enemies, and how we're supposed to deal with insult and all these other things that are usually in the context of when it's a non-believer, that usually in the context of, being treated unjustly, there's, the walk, if a Roman soldier, has you walk a mile, you walk an extra mile, because at that time, Israel was occupied by Rome, and a soldier could commandeer a citizen to have them carry their stuff for 1 mile. So the soldier didn't have to do it. And so he's saying, look, you walk a second mile to prove that you're the fact that you're not like everyone else. But what they forget about is that when you look at the biblical examples, whenever the word is being corrupted by other believers or by not, there is a very different strategy that is taken there. I would say any exchange with Jesus and the Pharisees is good. You brood of vipers, you outwardly you're whitewashed, but in your whitewashed tombs, your throat is open graves. I think one of the best examples also is in Galatians, when Paul is addressing Peter and the Judaizers that came in there, and they were, one of the things he says, I pulled this up. So here's the contrast, right? Beginning at Galatians 3. Oh, foolish Galatians. He's writing this to the church. Who has bewitched you? It was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified. Let me ask you only this. Did you receive the Spirit by works or by law? Works of the law or by hearing with faith? Are you so foolish? Having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected by the flesh? And so he just keeps going and just lays into them, and he calls out Peter, right? And so the point is that God, yes, of course and there's other times when it's like, how do you address a complaint with another believer? You talk to them, and then you maybe get an elder involved, and then you do it publicly. Like, yeah, sure. That's one thing. If it's a personal slight. But whenever it's a matter of the glory of God, the purity of Scripture, and the purity of the gospel, the Bible makes no bones
No
about it. Like,
compromise.
yeah, you take this seriously,
Yeah.
and you fight it head on. And this isn't about preserving the relationship. It's about, and if you believe that these are believers that you're dealing with, then that's secondary, because it's like, okay, I believe that they have the Holy Spirit, and that, I'm going to pray for them that they will ultimately come around to this. But I'm going to say what needs to be said and do what needs to be done. And I'm going to also be praying the whole time that God would check my heart, right? That would check that my heart's in the right place, that I'm not, being unloving, that I'm being authentic in terms of my obedience to the word. But I'm going to say what needs to be said. And so I think that too many take the approach of, that gentleness type thing that is, again, usually in a different context. It's personal slights, often as a witness, and how you handle that as a witness to non-believers, not how do you deal with the corruption of the gospel in the church. That's a different thing. And whenever that happens, it is dealt with severely, harshly, quickly, right? I mean, what happens whenever Moses come down and they built a golden calf? There wasn't a bunch of meetings to talk about hey, what did you mean by this? Right? This is idolatry. Yeah, this is idolatry. And so going back to, at the beginning when I said they don't understand this, I think that it's either the fact they don't understand it or all the other things we talked about, that they don't treat it the way it should be treated. And they will, hang their hat on other verses about being gentle and patient and all these other things. And they won't look at what are the examples of what happened whenever the gospel is being corrupted. And I think that probably is they don't understand that it's the gospel is being corrupted. Again, if it was their pastor or, their organization or whatever was all of a sudden saying, I think actually we're going to incorporate worship of Molech and Baal and Ashtaroth, in with our regular worship services, and the songs we sing, most people would recognize that for what it was, and it would be the thing on the forefront of their mind, because they would see that as a corruption of the gospel, and a corruption of worship and a corruption of obedience to God. And that it was that whatever it was, whatever language and similarity it shared with what they had previously been doing, it wasn't the same. It doesn't matter how much overlap there is, right? And so I think they have to understand it and then act accordingly with, okay, because that's what when I was telling my friend, I told you I was on the phone with him last night, and I felt so bad. I kept saying, just so you know, I'm not mad at you. I love you, man. Like, this is not about you. But I said, this just pisses me off so much because, it's not your fault, but you don't understand. You would not be this encouraged about maybe having open lines of dialogue if they were having you, conjure spirits or something like that. It just pick something. And so, I think my encouragement to people in terms of, you said, like, what's the plan of action? What do you do? Is understand it and take it seriously as a corruption of the gospel. Is something that whenever people follow that road, what it leads to in terms of the ideology, where it goes, how it corrupts relationships, how it poisons relationships, and how it poisons the gospel, how it poisons our identity. Whenever I forget who it was, there was some thing I saw from a presumably a believer who had said something about how we need to understand, like, people who say, well, we're all one body, they need to understand that, my identity is this, my identity is my skin color, as a Black woman or something like that. And it's like, you're saying that's the most transcendent identity, not if we're believers, we're both, in the body of Christ, like we're sons and daughters bought and paid for by Christ's redemptive act on the cross for us. That's not subservient to everything else. Are you serious? And so, like, people have to understand that what this is this is a thing that corrupts relationships and corrupts the gospel. No matter how much overlap, it's a false gospel. And as such, they have to respond the way they would if some other thing, if they have to envision, whatever else they have to envision of how they would respond if X, Y, or Z corruption entered into their church or their organization, how they would respond there, then envision that. But that's what they have to do, and take it seriously that way, and grow a pair, to be honest, be steely spined about it. We're told to have confidence. We're told to be bold. and our proclamation and sharing of the gospel and understanding the gospel. And they need to see that this is an extension of that. Okay, well, it looks like we lost Sarah. That's funny. Well, not funny, but we're going to end it there anyway. I'll give you guys all the information that I mentioned here. For those of you who watch this, I appreciate it. You know, I don't often put on my, you know, theology hat, so to speak, when it comes to this stuff, because I see these fights as one and the same. You know, winning this stuff in the culture, I think helps, you know, with the fight in the church, to be honest. I don't see them as being separate fights. I see them as being the same. And so I try to be as broadly appealing as possible in, you know, the content that I make. But you know, this is the root of it for me, to be totally honest. Is it just breaks my heart seeing how this ideology and this far-left orthodoxy is just corrupting the faith, corrupting the gospel, and corrupting believers, you know, who are falling for it and being duped, you know, just like the Galatians were duped by the Judaizers, you know, who they said, well, actually, you're not just saved by faith, you have to do all these other rituals, right? That's not any different than today, right? You're not just saved by faith, you have to do these rituals of repenting of your privilege and all of these other things. It's the exact same thing. And I think we have to have the same response in terms of this is foolish, this is wicked, and you're going to make shipwreck of your faith if you continue down this road, and do that lovingly with people. You know, the last thing I'll say is that book, you know, Pursuing Justice Without Compromising, something I forgot, I'll put a link to, is really good. One of the things that the author says in there is, he said, any pursuit of justice that doesn't start with God and isn't centered on God is a noisy gong and a clanging cymbal, you know, and referencing, you know, in 1 Corinthians, whenever Paul writes about love, and he's like, you know, if I have all this knowledge and I have all this power and I have all this faith, but I don't have love, then I'm nothing. I have nothing. I am nothing. And everything I do, it's not music. It's just noise. And so any justice, you know, social justice or otherwise, that doesn't have love in it, which if it has real love, it's going to be centered in the gospel. It's just noise. It's counterproductive noise. And I thought that was really good. Anyway, all right. Thanks for watching, everyone. I had to go, but you know, if this kind of thing you're into, if this kind of thing you're into, you're not going to see a whole lot of it on my content, to be honest, but my faith informs everything I do. Either way, I appreciate you watching. Please like, share, subscribe, follow me on my locals, join my locals community. It's awesome. That's at returntoreason.locals.com. Then Twitter is at My Mundane Mind. You can follow me there. On YouTube, Return to Reason, and then same with ThinkSpot and Medium. I'll post articles there occasionally. Return to Reason there as well. That's it. All right, everyone. I hope you have a great day. Thanks for watching, and I'll check you next time. Peace.